Okay, everyone, let's get started. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Colin Yeager. I teach in the English department at Rutgers University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Cultural Analysis, the CCA, which is sponsoring this event. I first read Peter Coviello's Make Yourselves Gods, Mormons and the Unfinished Business of American Secularism about 2 years ago. And it seemed to me such an incisive and brilliantly observed study, and it pushed the debate about secularism in directions that I found both exciting and provocative. And moreover, it was so beautifully written that I immediately started to plan with my colleague, Dana Luciano, how we could get Pete to visit Rutgers to talk about it. So welcome, Pete, and everybody to virtual Rutgers and virtual CCA. And please take this as a promissory note for some future face-to-face meeting.
The first time I had the pleasure of introducing Pete Coviello was at a queer studies conference at Cornell University in the spring of 1895, I think. He didn't yet have the impressive list of publications or the impressive scarf game, but he was already clearly a rock star. Pete is professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he teaches American literature and queer studies. He is the author of many publications spanning numerous venues and genres, but all of them, I think it's fair to say, both engage in some way and model the relationship between love and critical thought. Among these are 5 books, in addition to the one we're here today to discuss, Make Yourself Gods. The list includes Intimacy in America, Dreams of Affiliation and Antebellum Literature, Tomorrow's Parties, Sex and the Untimely in 19th Century America, which was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award and received honorable mention for the MLA Queer Caucus's Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize, Long Players, A Love Story of 18 Songs, and most recently, Violent Reread. He's currently at work on a new book, After Ahab, Tyranny in the Wake of the Age of Revolutions.
Ada, thank you very much. Can you hear me well enough? All right, I'm going to talk kind of briefly, just for a little while about the book and what I thought I'd do, rather than like just summarizing it, since my guess is that people will have a sense of what the book says more or less, is to say just a little something about how it came about, and then talk some about what its ambitions were, you know, so far as I can divine them from the tea leaves of the book that actually appeared. And then I thought to say just a few things about like what surprised me in the making of it, what in the event of research and writing I was not necessarily expecting to encounter, but felt energized, or felt was energizing or clarifying when I did. So I hope that's an okay way of proceeding, again, very briefly. A while back, I wrote a book about sex in the 19th century, sex in 19th century America and 19th century American literature, or about the forms sex could take in advance of its sort of more total captivation by taxonomies like hetero and homosexuality. And I was particularly interested in like the forms sex could take that would not be, that would fall aslant of those future arriving taxonomies, all the sort of futures for sex that would not come to be. And it occurred to me that you shouldn't write a book about sex in 19th century America without thinking at least a little about one of the great sex scandals of the 19th century, which was, of course, Mormon polygamy. And so with like a book of Joseph Smith's writings to hand, given to me by a graduating senior where I used to teach by the name of Jared Hickman, I just started reading a lot about, I just started reading a lot of Joseph Smith and reading a lot of Mormonism. And I wrote a chapter in that book about Mormonism, but it was sort of clear, it was kind of painfully clear that I was not near the end of what could or should be said about the Mormon 19th century. And so I began reading more and more, and as I encountered this like wealth of material, primary material, historiographic material, material from criticism, it got wrapped up in a set of critical languages that at the time I was interested in and invested in: queer theory, indigenous studies, post-secular critique, biopolitical genealogy, religious studies. It's out of this interest that this kind of messy book rather haltingly grew. And that really was its ambition, to tell a story of the 19th century that would be in sustained conversation with a whole range of critical discourses, while in the total service of no one in particular. In one sense, I think when I started, I thought my ambition was to like desecularize our more commonplace conceptual languages of race and sex, but really as I came along, the broader aim was to see how each part of this sort of weave of critical discourses might, as it were, do a little work to deprovincialize the others. How like an understanding of secularism might sharpen our queer theoretical senses of sex and racialization. How post-secular critique might itself be made more ample through an encounter with the exacting conceptual idioms of biopolitical genealogy or of native studies or the specificities of queer historiography. And this was just a way for me to, this was the ambition, and it's why the book sort of came out as it did, thinking about racialized religion and desecularized races. That weave of investments makes for the arguments of the book, which the very quickest way is like, I'm really interested in Mormonism as a carnal theology, as a cosmology at the center of which is a vision of the body and a vision of the material world as the thing that ligatures the world of the divine to the world of the human. That carnal theology seemed to me really important to understanding how the Mormons were ill-fitted to the disciplines of secular belonging that were forming around them. It seems to be really important for understanding what polygamy is. Polygamy is not some like notional appendage that just, oh, we just thought we'd be polygamous also. It's actually super important to that carnal theology. It also became super important to the many voiced racializations that would stalk the Mormons of the 19th century, a style of racialization that had in it comportments toward religiosity, toward property, toward gender, and toward sex that would have them compared to Indians, but produced as Mohammedans, produced them as Asiatics, as Africans, all with the purpose of manufacturing them as declining or dangerous and above all expendable life in the 19th century. This is sort of what I mean by saying the biopolitics of secularism. I guess it's probably worth saying that the Mormons honestly were indeed nearly annihilated a number of times, which makes for what a scholar named LaShawn Williams, who's an ultra sharp scholar of Mormonism and race, thinks of as like the traumatizing past that has helped keep contemporary Mormonism locked in like a fraught embrace with normative whiteness, which as Professor Williams notes is like not great for non-white members of the church. At any rate, in the 19th century, you can see a lot of Mormons trying to manage their failing place in a hierarchy of biopolitical life by attesting themselves more and more committed to the norms of the racial state, to its stark gendering, to its familialism, to its racial statecraft. This is what makes me call them like proto-homo nationalists. Anyway, that's basically the pitch of the book. Along the way, it tries to push back against liberalizing accounts of the Mormons that try to rescue them from more maligning accounts, essentially by turning them into good religion, making them into sort of normative practitioners of reasonable belief that I argue they in fact were not. But ultimately, what all this gives is the pitch of the book is to try to produce an exacting conceptual language to grapple with the problem and the question of secularism. As I say somewhere in the book aims to shine a light through early Mormonism in order to reveal the contours of the hegemonic formulation that envelops it. To illuminate, I mean, the arrayed and entangled forces that exerted themselves most forcefully upon the Mormons, that shaped and fettered and cajoled them, and that brought about those startling conversions whereby these racialized heretics and deviants became, in a relatively short frame of time, patriots to the United States and its empire of white monogamy, the nearest name I have for these conjoined forces and for their operative cogency is secularism. That's the pitch, anyway. Whether it's convincing or whether that gesture towards synthesis works, that's a whole other thing. As I was saying, as I read the book again for this, and like I still don't know if it works or not, but as I was mentioning earlier to the folks gathered, it's like, wow, for a while I knew a lot about Mormonism. I knew a lot of dates and names, and that was an exciting thing. And I read in part to be reminded of the things that surprised me along the way. I'll just say a couple of them. One was the how wrong polygamy seems to have felt to its practitioners and its most ardent defenders. That is to say, even those partaking in the principle of plural patriarchal marriage were heavily laden with a shame-rich sense of its just wrongness, which I think gets to what I try to argue is Smith's idea that polygamy was a sort of like institution of a certain denaturalization. That's one thing. That was not just men, but a lot of women. I'll say a second surprising thing. The shorthand for the second surprising and to me still amazing thing is Zina Diantha, about whom I write a sort of little biography in the middle of the book, whose story continues just to amaze me. It's amazing to me for the clarity with which it grasps the breadth of counter possibilities for women in early Mormonism, for women even in the already patriarchal early Mormonism, for unchecked female prophetic power, female access to divinity, and also for the way her story grasps a kind of for the like very sharp sorrow with which she narrates the kinds of foreclosure and enforced normalizing containment to which those ambitions were subject. Another surprise was the discovery that after the renunciation of polygamy at the end of the 19th century, the Mormon 19th century itself became a kind of sacred history in Mormonism, more so even than the Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants. The 19th century became the passage of exegesis across the country, the great struggles that were overcome, and that this was hugely consequential, not least because it installs sort of comedy with the state as like the destiny of sacred time. As though the Mormons' destiny, the often heretical and often like vigorously anti-state Mormons, as if its destiny was always to be a kind of American secular belonging. The effects of that are super weird when the destiny of sacred time is secular belonging. All the sort of counter-secularizing impulses that I try really hard to describe in the book become sort of ghostly and apparitional and hard to describe, or they become easy to describe as like a historian's wishful thinking, a kind of historians implanting in the past of things he might want to be there, like sexual deviancy, like carnal women, but that probably weren't. So that was important. Two more things that were surprising, I will say, and then I'll get out of the way. One was just kind of like what I would say with my friend and colleague, Jordy Rosenberg, like the persistence of the dialectic, like finding that in the book that the very thing that made the Mormons most ill-fitted to a regime of secular legitimacy, which is the idea of like incipient divinity of the mortal body, that people became gods, was precisely the formulation that could lead them back into the charmed circle of secular belonging. Secularism here in the register of like dominion, white divinization, a la Jared Hickman. This, for me, was like a great practical object lesson in the necessity of an analytic that bears in mind the ways all things are, as it were, pregnant with their own negation, that any mobilization carries within it the possibility of its own cancellation. The last thing I could not have guessed was how graciously and generously the book would be responded to by Mormon studies scholars, Ben Park, Kathleen Flake, Taylor Petrie, Christina Rossetti, and by like Mormons, especially like younger queer Mormons. That's been very heartening.
So I'll start by stating the obvious, kind of perhaps echoing some of Pete's comments there. I've learned a tremendous amount by talking with Pete this past decade. So I return the favor, inspiring conversations about everything, including the analytic merits of excessive italicization that have allowed me to appreciate anew the reflexivity and risk that are an essential part of what we call scholarship, right? And of course, I learned a shit ton about Mormonism, new archival details, but also, and most importantly, how to think with and across and eventually to think about Mormonism. It's nimble in telling a different kind of story about early Mormon history, one that is intensely reflexive in registering the different layers of a literary text and the different inflections of his own argument. Pete's book is a revelation, history and imminent critique both, right? And with so much style, miles and miles of it. Pete expertly steers the reader close enough to the shores of secularizing frameworks to see them and to learn from them, and yet not running aground. Evoking Foucault's pressing call to write without categories, Pete is a genealogist by any other name. So Make Yourselves Gods is a book that reframes or reimagines or Well, no, check that, right? Make Yourself Gods makes the early history of Mormonism available once again to the scholarly imagination. For in its energetic refusal of secular redemption as both a conceptual promise and a historiographical principle, Pete's book has inspired all manner of people in all manner of disciplines, fields, and subfields, right? With its spectacularly smart story about the life and times of polygamy. Mixing secular studies, queer theory, and consistently percolating prose, Pete creates an interpretive vortex of pressing questions around secularism and, quote, what he calls the pattern logics that bound racial status together with erotic deviance, gender stricture, and conformity to proper belief, unquote. And speaking as an historian of American religions, I want to testify here this afternoon in this algorithmic commons that there is no book in existence that approaches the dynamism, the horror, and the wild beauty of mid-19th century Mormonism with such intellectual dexterity and scenic skill. So sex, race, gender, true religion, and false, they all play out in Make Yourselves Gods as a network of associated categories, right? Alive and self-organizing, building up and out, threading their ways across skin and synapse and weaving their way into consciousness. Categories and their differential logic whose interactive, cross-wired, and looping quality generates, in Pete's telling, and his exacting attention to the fraught categorical production of secularism, all manner of corporate intrigue, petty habit, ecstatic joy, routine ritual, ideological maneuver, counter possibility, and foreclosure. Historically speaking, these are the categories, right? Sex, race, gender, true religion, and misfiring belief that have long worked together in their discursive production of one another and the metaphysics of this modernity. So a key payoff of this book, but certainly not the only one, is Pete's focus on the knotty proposition of the secular and the immanence of secular analytic categories. In this, it departs significantly from canonized histories of early Mormon practice, both dutiful and wayward both. Attuned not simply to the ways in which race, gender, and sexuality are tangled up in the making of Mormonism, and not merely epiphenomenal to Mormonism or somehow imposed upon them, Pete queries their exuberant relations and the individuals who stand at their intersection. And it is at this intersection, right, precisely as the truck of true religion and colonial power barrels down the road, it is at this intersection where something like secularism happens in this book, which is to say that in reading Make Yourselves Gods, one senses the danger of some kind of drunken imperium ever heading our way, what Pete pointedly glosses as, quote, the racialized theodicy of a liberalism speeding its way toward hegemony, unquote. So there is a danger for the Mormons, of course, right, who inhabited the distinct role of both standing in the middle of this intersection and driving the truck simultaneously. But there's also something dangerously liberating in Pete's kinetic analytic as he challenges readers who have not looked both ways, as it were, precisely because they have internalized various assumptions and binaries and advertisements for this secular age. And finally, dangerous for more dutiful historians who have tracked changes in early Mormonism over time, or for that matter, any other religion in the 19th century. There's a danger here, right? A simmering urgency to watch out and look up, to check yourself in relation to categorical hegemonies that are much, much closer than they appear. Nay, indeed, much more intimate to the practices of self-possessed historians than they could ever admit to. In all of this multi-tiered warning, in speaking forth truths that condition the very possibility of reading and writing history, Pete gestures more than a little to the prophetic tradition of Joseph Smith himself. So I will end my brief remarks about this brilliant book with a wedge and a question. So, first the wedge. Make Yourselves Gods is, on one hand, deferent to the fact that it is not the work of an historian, professionally defined, professionally trained, professionally rewarded. Indeed, this is a book that is all but unrecognizable to those historians whose default tendency is to see religion as a matter of agency versus structure, and all the wild market assumptions that cling to such a default sort of methodology. And it is a book, though, that is not fully appreciated and perhaps even misapprehended if it is merely understood as yet another critical, that is, non-historical intervention that gently reminds historians of the porousness of categories, scholarly ones as well as those inhabited by past actors. For Pete, the impurity and indeed the impossibility of categorical stasis is a working assumption rather than conclusion, right? And I had a phrase, I'll just say it now, I had a phrase that was working with Deleuze without all the hip static, right? I mean, it's good, right? But nevertheless, Pete's work has been read quite positively and productively by the professional class, right? But on the other hand, I believe that Pete's disciplinary humility is a bit overstated by him and some of his readers. For I also want to insist that Make Yourselves Gods is a book of history, period. As Pete writes near the beginning of his book, to study the Mormon archive is to be, quote, confronted at virtually every turn with the meanings and counter-meanings so extravagant and overripe, and also so strangely telegraphed in their density of signification, so as to outstrip the conceptual frameworks we bring to it, unquote. According to Make Yourselves Gods, Mormonism is not so much unmappable given such excess, but rather subversive to the very concept of mapping Mormonism in only two dimensions. That is, using merely the coordinates of change over time. Make Yourselves Gods, in other words, is history told in three dimensions. Changes over time, to be sure, as categories and the lives inflected by them recalibrate and evolve, often in seemingly paradoxical paths. But also, and I cannot emphasize this enough, changes in time. That is, how categorical constellations in the lives inflected by them are vital and moving and paradoxical things in the very moment of their inflection. There are, in Pete's Foucauldian insistence, secret and chaotic wars going on all the time, in time and across. And here, I would note Pete's devastatingly beautiful account of the complexities and contradictions involved in Zina Diantha's long-running experiment in being human. So attentive to the feedback loops, both positive and negative, at any given moment, Make Yourselves Gods jettisons the tried and true linear evolutions of the professional class and the attendant categories that make their stories so appealing to those who stand blinkered at the intersection, and the proverbial truck keeps on trucking. So, it has been a joy to revisit this book after a bleak, bleak time. Joy to be had in its transcription of the cadences of early Mormon life and how they changed over time. Joy to be had in its writerly performance of Mormonism in flux. Joy to be had in its ear for the ambiguities of Joseph Smith's prophetic utterance and how Mormon prophecy lent itself to stasis and sudden flights both. Joy to be had in its attention to the semiotic atonality of secularism and how, in playing up and down the keyboard of an explicitly racialized sexual depravity, Pete's words, secularism makes a rhyming kind of sense. So, if this is correct, and I very much think it is, when Pete gently chides a still vital tradition of Mormon history making for its liberalizing and secularizing torque, and if Pete is correct, and I very much think he is when he writes that such historiography ever positions itself as an encounter with the sacred, I am left with a question that is both flippant and serious. What is the status of the sacred in Pete's own historiographical imagination?
I too want to thank everyone who helped organize this, especially Colin and Dana. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation and offer thoughts about this truly capacious, creative book. You've already heard a testimony about that. I can add my testimony too. And if you've read it, you know that it, even as it addresses very somber aspects of the history of American biopolitics, it serves up a whole array of intellectual surprises and pleasures. And if I didn't know better, I might have suspected that Pete Coviello lit upon this conjunction of secularism and Mormonism because it was his great chance to write in the mode of what he calls Smithian prophetic extravagance, which is a good mode for him. For all of that splendid variousness and extravagance, though, in rereading it, I found myself dwelling on the pedagogical achievement of this book. And what I mean is that To Make Yourself Gods offers us a remarkably economical way of grasping the very hard to grasp thing called secularism, or in this case, American secularism. Conversations about secularity can get muddled and get muddled fast, but Coviello's insight is that the story of the Mormons allow him to trace the force field of secularism with a new kind of vividness, precisely because what early Mormons believed and the social world those beliefs made possible, were so anathema to a consolidating secular order. Crucially, that order was and is entirely hospitable to religion, but only as long as religion comported itself with a certain metaphysics or a certain structuring of the real. Early Mormonism failed that test and thus failed to count as a religion proper for a long time. And as Coviello tells the story, that failure is illuminating. It's good to think with. This book helped me think about the Mormon story as something like the barium dye for a GI tract imaging. It provides a contrasting outline, enabling us to see an image of an enveloping set of conditions, pressures, powers that are otherwise invisible. What's also noticeable about this way of drawing on the Mormon story is that it's centered not just on the much discussed Mormon practice of polygamy, but on the distinctive theology of the flesh that subtends that. In Coviello's telling, what made Mormons intolerable to the secular order was not just their sexual ethics or their aberrant kinship, in other words, but a particular understanding about the ontological nature of the human body. What emerged from Smith's evolving prophetic thought was the conviction that the stuff of human material life is not different in kind from the material being of God. Instead, human life has as one of its potentialities not just salvation, but divination. Humans are gods in embryo. This is a fairly unremarkable idea if you grow up in the LDS faith tradition, as I did, and hear from an early age that God was once a man and that humans who ascend to their highest potentiality can be gods. But as you eventually figure out, this tends to be a surprising, even shocking idea to outsiders, especially if you sit with the idea that God has a body of parts and passions, and then you dwell on the passions part, which present-day Mormons don't often do, but which Coviello very much does dwell on. Surprise, surprise. Although I'm not an expert in Mormon studies, I don't think many scholars outside of church theologians have given much attention to this feature of Mormon metaphysics. But Coviello does, in part because that radical theory of embodied life, as he calls it, is crucial for tracking why Mormon belief in cosmology had such a fractious career in the conceptual environment of 19th century secularism. Mormon's theory of embodiment matters so much, he argues, because embodiment itself is such a crucial defining concern of the secular order, especially when it comes to racialization. So the question of embodiment becomes the linchpin for Coviello to reinsert Mormon history into US political history, but in a way that now opens up for us just how profoundly this liberal Republican state, this secular state, cares about embodiment. It cares not just about race and not just about sex and sexuality, but it cares maybe more fundamentally about a tacitly theological metaphysics that always already structures those identities and that produces the theological prestige that might be called whiteness and produces the theological stigma of those bodies that fall outside of whiteness, the Mohammedan body, the pagan native, and so on. For me, this idea of spiritual carnality is compelling and really illuminating for this broader history and opens up many exciting lines of thought. It's also a site where I would like to put some analytic pressure. And so a question I would pose somewhat schematically, too schematically, would go something like this, and I can pose it directly to Pete. If I'm understanding you right, you value the spiritual carnality of the early Mormon cosmology because it fosters a sociality that is, let's say, horizontal rather than vertical. So in contrast with the closed, privatized structure of the monogamous home, and that home's vertical links to the state with all of its racializing and imperializing powers, in contrast with that, the eroticized sociality of the early Mormon world allowed for lateral interlacing relations and pleasures. Your list, one of your lists is friendship, family, embodiment, sex. This comes through exuberantly in the early part of the book as you tell the story of the queer sociality, the queer sociability, you say, of the Nauvoo era. This is Mormon world making under the sign of joy, and it contains counter-secular and counter-imperial energies. But later in the book, you take a second pass through this scene, and this time you alert your readers to the elements of that cosmology that are quite vertical, that are not about growing together to godhood ecstatically, collectively, but are about being a god over others. As you write, there had always been inflections that led away from the premises of the secular, not away from the premises of the secular, but toward them. There were always the hierarchies of patriarchy. There was always a theodicy that was from the first bound up with whiteness, if ambivalently and in complicated ways. You call this the doubleness of Mormon thought and make a really compelling case that that's a real doubleness and an indwelling tension. But I found myself musing over how separable they really are or what it means to separate them. Are those more vertical imperial aspects, the pleasures not of friendship and shared joy, but the pleasures of dominion, which are pleasures? Do those come from the outside, from Mormon secularism, or are they perhaps inherent in divinization, in any grammar of redemption that culminates in exaltation and becoming a god? To put the question too reductively, is the Mormon grammar of redemption something anathema to secular metaphysics, or could it be something more like a theology that more openly spells out what being an American god means or could mean? Does it say the quiet part out loud? That puts it too starkly, but I'm sure you have thought that through, and I'd be interested in those thoughts. I think you kind of broached that a little bit in your comments, Pete, in talking about dialectics and the negativity that might reverse and then reverse again. But I say this in part because in situating Mormonism as the uncanny other to secularism, you let us see that the liberal or secular order isn't so inhospitable to divination after all. On the contrary, there are strains of deification all over US history. You mentioned the antebellum slave master and how he is able to partake of a godlikeness that is rare on the earth. Toni Morrison captures that feeling, that pleasure, brilliantly in one of her essays, From Playing in the Dark. The tenets of liberalism meant that the godhood of the slave master is eventually expelled, but you and others have underscored how the ascendancy of whiteness in modernity means that there are other kinds of white godlikeness available in the liberal secular world. When I hear the phrase, make yourself gods, I can't help but think sometimes about our Silicon Valley tech gods, for instance. These men are emphatically worldly, of course. They are offering us better living through science, not through faith. And yet their fondest projects are pretty telling when they spend millions and billions on trying to defeat the mortality of their bodies, for instance, in cryogenics and other things. And most recently, of course, the most powerful among them are propelling themselves into the heavens in rocket ships, all in the name of saving the rest of us, of course. So just to draw this together, within the secular grammar of redemption, it seems to me there is a clear economy. It claims to be very generous to the rest of humanity when it comes to salvation, but that's because it's so parsimonious when it comes to divination, right? Only some people get to be gods, and that's what makes them gods. And those two things are structurally related, right? So if it seems fruitful, I'd be interested in hearing how we can understand how what you call the uncanceled possibilities in the Mormon grammar of redemption might escape or might be related to or might cancel that economy or that logic. But thanks again for the chance to reflect on this rich and wonderful and truly provocative book.
I am going to focus my comments on the profound import of Make Yourselves Gods for queer theory, for the study of biopolitics, and especially for a kind of nexus of queerness and secularism. This nexus is a thorny one for sure. It has, in the last several decades, I would say, consolidated a kind of queer secularism, queerness that is wedded to and constructed by a fantasy of transgression of the disciplining strictures of sex and gender. So in this attachment to transgressing normativity, queer secularism insidiously iterates the theological precepts of Christianity, most pointedly the miracle that transmutes into the exception. Sexual exceptionalism sutures a binary opposition between an ostensibly secular queerness and what must be the homophobic and transphobicness of religiosity. Queerness thereby plays its part in maintaining the distinctions, as Pete writes, between good religion and bad belief, between faith and fundamentalism. And this also is subtended by a convivial relationship between homonationalism and Christian secularism, whereby liberal forms of personhood are rendered through the Christian confessional as a portal to what Foucault called the speaker's benefit. That is, the queer liberal subject emerges from the confines of repression to speak his, her, or their truth, announcing and performing what Pete names as sex as the liberal secular linchpin of selfhood. So following from that, we could therefore read coming out, for example, as a Christian technology of queer self-making that organizes liberal agendas of visibility, rights, and a sexual personhood that puts duress on other iterations of religion that are not wedded to such theological exceptionalisms. So most pertinent to this problematic and most relevant to what I've worked on in the past is the figure of the Muslim queer, who is forever under duress to explain his, her, their truth through the terms of Christian secularism that denies a priori religiosity to queers, hypocritically demanding a reconciliation of Islam and queer sexuality through those very same terms of objection. Pete cites Gil and Najjar's pithy formulation of the stakes. Orientalism is secularism, and secularism is Christianity. Secular queerness then contributes to this dynamic, insofar as the failure to be secular is also a failure to be queer. If the analytic of the secular predetermines what religiosity is, displaying a self-ratifying power, Pete's framing of secularism as a biopolitics, a quote, fused disciplinary calibration of sex, racial status, and religiosity, as well as a brand of imperial politics, marks a dialectical recursiveness as the engine of legitimacy, the mode by which secularism instantiates itself. So in the spirit of Pete's adamant position that Make Yourselves Gods is first and foremost a work of queer theory, a study whose deepest conceptual depths are to queer theory and queer critique, these are his words, I would consolidate his numerous insights thusly, and of course reductively. Insofar as polygamy is an easy target for queer theory's embrace of the non-normative, a category that is overly generalized, rarely geopolitically situated, and about which I have many questions. And even though queer theory might focalize polygamy as a queer practice or available for queer reading, or even perhaps in a continuum of sorts with polyamory, and even though Pete decidedly asserts that the early Mormons are queer, and even though this assertion might lean heavily on Kathy Cohen's differentiation between heterosexuality and heteronormativity as a difference of, shall we say, queerliness, what I think Pete does most effectively is shift us away from the easier and derailing target of polygamy to attend to what has already been highlighted as this racialized deviant carnality, the divinization of flesh through what Joseph Smith proselytized as exaltation. And Pete writes, this is the body's startling capacity for self-confounding, self-enlarging pleasure, of which polygamy is only one element or one conduit. So though pleasure in the idiom of queer theory has been itself somewhat secularized insofar as that it is attached to a queer liberal subject, I'm thinking of scholars whose work we could corral into this kind of fun toggle between celebrating the pleasures of queer bodies, lives, and communities on one hand, and the surfacing of queerly pleasures on the other. Theologies of the flesh, as Nancy just said. So I'm thinking about Amber Musser's work. Carlos de Sena has a beautiful forthcoming book on conversion, sexuality, and spirituality. Dana's work as well, Mel Chen, there are many others. The second and undoubtedly more critical import of Pete's work follows from Molly McGarry's pivotal research on, quote, the solidification of modern sexuality and that of secular hegemony that were co-joined processes in the 19th century. So in other words, the inextricable mutuality of the history of modern sex and the history of secularism, which make them not one and the same, of course, but certainly histories that are untellable without each other. And in fact, as Pete writes, quote, the history of sexuality looks a lot like a secularization narrative. So in an ingenious turn, and as queer homage to Eve Sedgwick's now epic structure of the axiom and the axiomatic, and also I think as a nod to Hortense Spillers, Pete frames the kind of obvious yet unstated punctums of what he calls the structuring grammar of secularism. The axiomatic as form, its power lives in the uncertainty of whether it will be, in Sedgwick's words, boring or shocking. The structuring methodology is also, and this is what Nancy calls, I think, or is one example of what Nancy calls the economic pedagogical achievement of the book, reflects what has long been theorized as the open secret of homosexuality. And Pete's deployment of it here functions to parallel the open secret of sex with yet another, the open secret, that of secularism. That is to imply the truth of sex is on some level the truth of secularism. And as any non-Christian born of immigrants teenager growing up in the United States will tell you, facing your oblivious classmates who are freshly adorned with new clothes, gadgets, trinkets on January 3rd every year is a confounding experience of Christian consumptive excess produced as a secular rite of passage to Americanness. And yes, I am this aforementioned teenager. But anyway, to return to the multiplicities of the open secret, this axiomatic rendering of sex with the structuring grammar of secularism prepares the reader for the rest of the analysis, at once reiterating McGarry's thesis, but also joining it with another untellable without the other history of imperial politics. So the whitening of Mormons concomitant with and reliant upon the ongoing genocidal manifestation of natives as irredeemably savage, along with what Pete calls the necessary servility of African Americans. So this triad of the ascendancy of whiteness, this is Ray Chow, of inhabiting the proper place of liberal sexual subjecthood in the renunciation of polygamy, and of the wholesale signing onto the racisms of the settler, colonial, and imperial American state. This triadic hell is what Pete calls proto-homonationalism. So I really appreciate Pete's capacity to both articulate from a historical vantage what homonationalism was or could have been. And his analysis moves us from the deviant carnality of early Mormonism to what he calls their journey towards current day hypernormativity, which he defines as, and this is wonderful, quote, a normalcy more normal than the merely normative. Even while brilliantly tying together the to be redeemed native as the colonial precedent for gay redemption, Pete cautions against an all too often deployed telos of race follows sex that we can often see in civil rights discourses. He provocatively avers that, quote, homonationalism has a history as long as and longer than homosexuality, and the Mormons are that history. So what I take this to mean is that proto-homo-nationalism marks the formative, indeed the advent of the cohesions of race, empire, and sexuality as, quote, the operative elements of a biopoliticized arrangement of liberal power. And what I would add to that, the funneling of populations into the make-live vector through the violent expulsion of others. What this proto-history illuminates is not so much if, but how current-day homo-nationalism in the United States requires Christian secularism with its attendant respectability politics that solicits properly sexual subjects, both hetero and homo, and with its ever-expanding securitizing apparatuses that disappear Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism as to make it hard to even recognize it as such, as structural racism. This would suggest that securitization and secularism go hand in hand. And Pete, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, offering seemingly innocuous folding into life that is cover for a more coercive rite of passage to Americanness that, among other things, naturalizes all Muslims as legitimate targets of surveillance. So one question that this transit that Pete sketches from the 19th century to the post 9/11 era raises is about which deviant subjects are ascertained to be recuperable and redeemable and how. So for a while, the Mormons were, quote unquote, allowed to pay their dues tenfold in the form of an ever compensatory racial and sexual hypernormativity. What kinds of Islam, if any, are rehabilitatable? And I'm following Pete's citational trails here. These are the people he's engaging with. So for Talal Assad, for example, I'm guessing the answer is none, as Islam is not apprehended as a religion, but always demonized as a political formation. Or perhaps we are talking about Mahmoud Mamdani's good Muslim, bad Muslim bifurcation that recasts the break of good religion from bad beliefs from within Islam itself. Or perhaps we're talking about both. Interestingly, Deepa Kumar argues that in the post-war McCarthy era, Islam as religion and its state iterations in the Middle East were marshaled as part of the arsenal to destroy communist regimes and horizons, while Islam as threat only really takes hold in the convening years of the 1967 Israeli occupation of Palestine, the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the subsequent hostage crisis, and late and post-Cold War voids that Islam as global threat are made to fill. So recent work from Anjali Fatima Raza, Kob, and Ghassan Haj, among others, highlights how the planetary reaches of Christian secularism and American empire cohere to produce a figure that is not in Pete's book, but is beyond the pale, irredeemable, and of global relevance, and that is the Islamic terrorist.
Nancy asks an incredibly difficult question about the sort of knotted togetherness of divinization and its parsimony with the pleasures of dominion. And I don't know that I have, and I think there would be two answers, one of which would be the rather obvious one that under conditions of the metaphysics of liberal secularism, there is no possibility of a project of divinization that is guarded against a hierarchical dominion. It just will. It just is an inbuilt necessity. I've just been thinking about this because, of course, you're right. What begins in the book as this incipient divinity, as the thing that's unassimilable to the liberal hegemonies forming themselves as against the Mormon, ends up being the thing that most adheres them to the settler project, that most gives them the theological prestige that we might call whiteness, in Nancy's amazing phrase. And that dialectical turning is just sort of something that I produced, but haven't quite been able to, as you can hear me say, quite been able to think the knottedness of it beyond saying that it is a perfectly dialectical knot. I guess I would say my own work toggles, perhaps not with the fluency of better dialecticians, between a desire to underscore with Jared Hickman or Gil Anajar or Talal Asad or Saddam Mahmoud, the imperial project inside divinization, and also not to surrender what the unexpired possibilities of embodiment that are always being subject to capture, but are also moving in different directions. That Smith seems to me really interested in. That Fanon, like, oh my body, make of me always a man who questions, gestures toward that unexpiredness, which is of course always subject to capture. That's a sort of poor answer to the question, but it is also as close as I can come to answering John's question, like, what is sacred? I don't know, man. Like, the two answers I would give are, like, one, of regard for an analytic regard for the ways people struggle necessarily inside the secular mechanics that produce them, not outside. And again, nobody's work more than Jasbir has taught me about the rigor of thinking about the insideness and not being satisfied with easy accounts of a sort of outsideness. So I would say, like, part of what the sacred would be, like, an analytic regard for the way people struggle, and also a genuine sense that the murderous metaphysics of imperial secularism do not actually code the entirety of what is, period. And that we may have a very halting access to that, but there are lots of different attempts upon it. And that has, at least, and perhaps impermissibly, kept alive a real flame of interest for me in Smith, who I don't have to tell you the kinds of malignant uses to which his thought has been turned. That seems fantastically obvious, and one can do that work, and some of that work is in the book. But I'm also interested in him as someone who also thinks there is something unexpired, even by the widest horizon of the imperial metaphysics of secularism, in the world, whether it's in the body or someplace else. Whether that's, call it sacred, I don't know. I would probably feel uncomfortable with that. Just seems a sort of overblown way of talking about something. But that would be the best answer I could give to that incredibly heartening provocation about genealogy and history. There's so much, like, talking to you all, there's just so much that the book, it's a kind of narrow book, like, it doesn't, it has, I've read T.J. Talley, but there's so much to be said about comparative polygamies. There's just so much to be said in and outside of the register of queer theory, some of them sort of like post-colonial theory, and those things can come together. And that the work of the book doesn't do that. It doesn't set the Mormons in conversation with other para-Protestantisms. It just doesn't really do a lot other than try to think hard about what the consequences of this carnal theology might be, and what might be afforded to us by thinking really closely along with it.
I wanted to ask you to just expand a little bit on the worry that you expressed, I think, in the early part of your remarks, that the kind of march towards liberal secular subjectivity, which is the overarching story that you tell, methodologically might have caused you to want to find kind of eddies of resistance, or kind of moments of, if not outsideness, at least the possibility of rupture, which is a phrase you use at one point.
Yeah, no, Colin, that's a great question. And again, you're going to hear me tremendously indebted to my interlocutors today, who all of whom are very, very good at not surrendering in one's critique, in one's analytic capacity, to secularizing presumption. That is to say, it's incredibly easy to take up Smith or Mormonism or the Mormon prophetic tradition according to a secularizing, weekly debunking set of analytic properties that I just didn't want any part of. Similarly, and this is for me very vivid in thinking about the women of the Mormon 19th century. It's very easy to produce Mormon women as in need of rescue, as in need of arriving at the safe harbor of secular redemption. And as a number of great theorists who I'm trailing, great like feminist theorists of secularism, say like, that presumption follows no matter how explicitly the women involved say, I do not care for or want secular rescue. And so the challenge for me was to find the chapter about Zina Diantha's exemplary, to try to find, on the one hand, what it was in her account that was powerful about this particular version of Mormonism. What it enabled for her. And that seemed to be a kind of like prophetic power, unchastened by the distinctions of gender. And also be able to produce the ways that in the sort of matrix of historical unfolding, the possibilities for that power were foreclosed. This is where, as Dana points out, Brigham Young becomes a kind of a villain, because part of his project was to systematize, routinize, normativize the Mormons in relation to a settler empire that at once he felt as an enemy, but that he also wanted to be part of. And that dynamic, so in other words, I was trying to find a way both to hold to what a figure like Zina Diantha found unbelievably powerful in unsecularizable terms about the prophetic tradition of Mormonism, while also not sheltering it, therefore, from the rigor of what we might blandly call historical critique. I think this is part of what was at stake when Dana was talking to me all those years ago, is like, the identification with Joseph Smith is useful in a lot of ways. It can also be distorting. It can also be misapprehending. It can also produce exactly the dynamic of the fetishization of a kind of Christian transgression that Jasbir is talking about, which I have hoped to avoid, but don't know that I have entirely in my relation to Smith.
I might just jump in and say that I think that little biography of Zina Diantha comes closest to answering what I was chewing over and thinking of, in that she claims for herself that divinization, right? And exercise it as power. So it's the pleasure of power, but it's not very vertical,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Oh, Nancy, that's amazing.
At least in that one moment, right? Or that moment of a dialectic, you get her claiming power as power, but not as overtly power over others, you know, ruling and imposing and saving.
Yeah, that's so, I mean, it's such a knotty problem because of course, in some ways, as many people who've written about Zina Diantha say, like, all the pleasures of her world are lateral. They're sociability. They're the fomenting sociability of early Mormon life was where she felt most empowered. It's also true that her speaking in tongues is always coming in the context of like settler dominion, which she is also very much a part of. You know, so like that. Right, but it's so like that again, the untwistable dialectical knot of that. I mean, I guess one thing I'll say is like writing about this and being encouraged to write about this by, again, all the people here was kind of a pleasure, because it gave me a chance to like try to do that work, you know.
Could I just add to that? You know, one of the things that I think you were quite successful conceptually in sort of enacting a kind of post-secular critique, avoiding those kind of secular frameworks of analysis of religion and sexuality that you're doing. You know, and one of the things I was putting this together, and at some point I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to pick out all the phrases that I love from this book, you know, and just kind of put them together. But it kind of begs the question, as a writer, right? Not just as a thinker, but as a writer, like, is there anything about this book, about the way you wrote this book, the language you use? You know, for example, you keep using the phrase and yet. That's repeated throughout. That does a lot of work for you. Are there any other kinds of, you know, poetics that you were trying to sort of use or deploy in making your argument?
John, you've got exactly and like I, when you write the book and then you get it back and then you get it back, like I realized there's a kind of compulsive and yetness, which I'm sure is irritating to the reader, but nevertheless, that I was able to be like, oh, that's part of the commitment I've learned from the people whose work I love most, who happen to be in the room now, that if you're not turning the thing that you're arguing back against itself and trying to get beneath its permission granting conditions, then you're kind of going to have a flat analysis. I mean, part of what it led me to, I think some of the rhetorical, what I guess might be called excess of the book, is like a real commitment to making the Mormon project at least legible in some of its force. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, it's sort of unsatisfying to have a kind of like anthropological delectating relation to Mormonism, as though it were this other thing and it was unimaginable why people were willing to give up their lives for it. And to hold to that while also noting it's just absolute participation in the like tripartite horrors that Jasbir was describing of their like rush to enter into the empire of white monogamy, as bloodied as need be.
If I could just add just really quickly to John's comment about the poetics, and this is kind of what I meant about the buoyancy of the text as a kind of pedagogical strategy, and the exuberance as well, which permeates all of your writing. But it really strikes me as a kind of methodological approach to biopolitics, which you don't actually, I don't feel like I see enough of. That kind of porosity and buoyancy around, well, it could be this, and then there's this, and yet. I thought it was really effective and conveyed the malleability of biopolitics, the plasticity of it, the folding in, folding out, folding in, folding out. John, you mentioned something about the Deleuzian static, which I am guilty as charged, but in a sense, there's that movement going on in the text that I think is part of the kind of Deleuzian approach that Pete actually just enacts instead of describes, right?
There are some really interesting, explicit sort of reflections on style in relation to method in your introduction, and people can't help themselves, understandably, rightly so, like commenting on sort of the writerly style. So I wanted to ask you about to what extent you might be prepared to go so far as to suggest that the style substance binary is a secular binary, right? We could trace it to the Cartesian cogito, right? Or and with that, like a question, I'm trying to figure out exactly how to formulate it, but something like, if you would be prepared to say that, whatever, not saying that there are any, of course, but whatever failures of dialectical sort of argument might occur, right? A falling back on sort of doubleness, right? Sort of as a figure of an unresolvable or an undialectalizable sort of element, right, of the phenomenon, or if those are, compensated for to some extent by what I think it was John who well described a kind of like a kind of homage to Smith's style, right? Like a kind of stylistic mirroring happening. I mean, I think John's comment was something like that. Maybe you wrote this book so that you could speak.
That was Nancy.
In the voice of Smithian prophecy, and some of your readings of the style of Smith's sermons are I think some of the best things that have been said about just the style. You capture this particular kind of like vernacularizing, debunking, this sort of like offhanded, like, oh yeah, the whole history of religion to this point is wrong. And let me, I wonder, yeah, what you could say, what
Yeah.
more you might want to be prepared about style as method, or style
Yeah.
as something that captures something that that exceeds method, that is itself method, and with that, if you know, part of the work of the book is to trouble the sort of style substance binary as in and of itself arguably sort of secular.
Yeah, Jared, that is a great question. I'm going to have to think more about the style substance binary as secular, but I think indeed you are the best person to do it. I think you can trace it down to its philosophical roots more capably than I will. A couple things to say though about style. The first is I absolutely recall that the first person who said anything about me ever about Joseph Smith as a stylist was you. And what you pointed out to me precisely was the way that these like kind of stagey, sort of Old Testament midrash, like bad imitation Old Testament windy passages would get punctuated by these pure moments of like quotidian ordinariness. And once I started looking for that, they just were everywhere. And like, that's like, that became like understanding Smith's style became really important to me for the understanding the way he understood the mortal world to be sort of undisenchanted, and the way that he understood divinity and the mortal world to just be absolutely in flooding together. So on that front, it was important. As far as like imitating Smith, I don't know that I do plain spokenness as well as I might. That seems to be a failing of like a person who likes James too much and likes the ornate sentence. But I will also say, like, more seriously, like, yeah, it seemed to me, I mean, here's another way of putting it, which is that my capacities as a dialectical thinker are maybe not all they might be. You know what I mean? Like I think about that all the time. Like the analytic tradition to which I was reared with others in the room really had a lot to do with Foucault and a lot of the forms of analysis that come around him, psychoanalysis as well. And it wasn't till later, and perhaps when those synaptic paths had already been forged, that I got to like Marx, that I got to the 18th Brumaire, that I got to, or that I better understood how much Marx was in Foucault, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like I'm late to the game of dialectical thinking as a conceptual apparatus. But what I do have is a sense of the argument as written. And I would go to the mat for Henry James as an astonishing dialectical thinker, a person for whom things are always turning into their negation, like always, always, always. And they happen at the level of the sentence, which was a very important stylistic unit for me. So a way of saying it is that it seems to me now as we're talking about it, that like the style that, I mean, the simplest thing is I want work that sounds like me. You know, I want work that sounds like my voice talking and saying the most complicated thing it can say, which is a different voice than the one that you fight about things in the bar with. But this is like the podium voice in the book. And it seems to me that the part of the reason that voice speaks the way that voice speaks, with the and yets and the hesitations built into compound sentences, is to do with the prevailing sense that my conceptual dialecticism only goes so far and probably needs to go further. And that is the place at least where I can have it, or have a richer version of it, you know? That's, I guess, another way of saying it is sentences like that are the best I can do to make myself think as hard as I want to think.
I can't believe I'm about to ask a question about theology. But I'm still stuck on the question of the sacred that John brought up. Mm-hmm. And maybe to put it in a slightly different way, as I was reading, I really thought of you as a de facto theologian. And I was kind of fondly reminded of a lot of feminist theology. Like, especially in the 90s, there's this whole movement in feminist theology to reimagine Christian origins. Mm-hmm. Like folks like Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza are looking at episodes from early Christianity and then rereading them kind of for use in the present. And it struck me as a really kind of similar structural move that you were doing. So I guess like just one observation, maybe like a little too bluntly stated, is this focus on theology struck me as very secular. You know, a focus on Smith and his intellectual history and his doctrine and his theology. And so I guess if there's a question, it's, you know, how would this look differently if instead of starting with Smith's idea of embodiment, you kind of started with a more like workaday Mormon's experience of embodiment?
This is a weird answer. I wrote a book about Thomas Pynchon, a novel of his that I love very much, not long ago. And our colleague, Jordy Rosenberg, was kind enough to write something about it. And Jordy wrote something about the utility of a certain kind of identification with one's objects, that one wishes to redescribe them as from the inside of them. And that certainly seems, it would not have been a thing I would have said to you, whatever, 4 years ago writing it. But when I read it again, I was like, wow, I was really committed to like free and direct discoursing a lot of Smith, like a lot of Smith. And I totally take your point about it being a very secular move, because it is for me, because it's a literary critical move. You know what I mean? It's like, what do I know how to do? I know how to get intricately inside what I will reproduce as the organizing consciousness of a given text. And I don't know how to do basically anything else, which John knows, because I spent like years telling him, I can't write this book. I can't write this book. I don't have any of the tools. I don't know how to write a book that's not built on exegetical set pieces. Like, this person wrote this, here is the analysis done. And John kept saying, yes, you do. Yes, you do. So it's therefore it's very difficult for me to imagine what a book would have been like that started with a sort of workaday experience of like Mormon embodiment. Though I guess I would say part of the reason this becomes sort of important to me is, in an interesting way, one of the responses I've gotten to the book is like, this is cool. This doesn't seem right about the ordinary experience of Mormon embodiment in the 19th century. Particularly, though not exclusively about women. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know about that. Like that, it's difficult for me to say of people of the Mormon 19th century who were so much a part of this carnal theology that none of it, however it would or would not have been expressed in whatever idioms it would have found for itself, including the idiom of the daily lived life that was sometimes polygamous, would have had quite that little purchase, you know what I mean? So that the forms of embodiment you find walking around when people are fixing their fences or whatever might look very quotidian and run-a-day and American, but I would suggest that it is perhaps the case that they are not quite so, you know? And that the only way I, as a like incapable historian, had access to that was by routing it through a very queer theoretically inflected, like super identificatory reading of Smith, if you know what I mean. And so that's been my counter proposition, has been like the embodied lives of people in the 19th century look different. They just look different when read through a cosmology, through the lens of a cosmology that you take seriously as about carnality and divinity. That doesn't solve it. That is not to say that anyone who's like, yeah, man, I don't know that carnal extravagance defines the lives of Mormon women in the 19th century. That is a fair thing to say. It's an absolutely fair thing to say. I would say that it might.
Forgive me while I kind of talk my way into this question. Kind of builds on what was just raised in the testimonials about how make yourselves gods is kind of outside of the normal historical Mormon studies framing. And one of the points that the book argues hardest for is this idea that, you know, early Mormon theology is really founded on this idea of polygamy, and that polygamy is not just like some accident of history or like something they reluctantly arrived at, but it's actually like a part of their theology around incarnation and carnality. but I guess like, that does seem sort of like not the predominant narrative frame for understanding Mormonism. That that's not normally what we think of. And I guess my question is just like, what kind of led you to the methodology that like set up outside of the predominant historical framings, or even maybe even against it?
Thank you. That's a great question. I'll say frankly that one of the, like, how did I come? This was like, it came out of a real ignorance of the great wealth of Mormon historicization. Like I'm a English professor, you know what I mean? So I first encountered this trying to write a book about the history of sexuality and trying to catch up with the work of Mormon studies, which was super, super, super interesting. But interesting in part because it was at a distance to me. I didn't feel necessarily conscripted to or by it. It wasn't a field that I had to answer for making go forward. But I guess I would say that it doesn't in any way mean to be a corrective to Mormon studies. It really doesn't. It just tries to situate itself adjacent to, if not quite within. It does mean to be not a corrective, or maybe a corrective, I don't know. It does mean to push back a little bit on what I just would think of as the impulse in the 20th century, particularly, to rescue the Mormons from the people who maligned them. And there are many such people who do so with like greater and lesser vigor, and who did so more and less murderously in the 19th century, to rescue the Mormons by saying, you know what, they were misapprehended in their time. Really, they were just practitioners of good religion like every other good religionist of the 19th century. And like, I understand that move. That's not a dismissible move, but I did not want to do that move because it seemed to me that the Mormons were actually not practitioners of good religion, of secular Christianity, and that much of the point of it was that they were committed to not being, except for the moments when they wanted to be back into the fold of secular legitimacy. And I didn't want to understate that. And it seemed to me, and this was one of the things that I learned, that the carnal theology was really at the beating heart of that rewriting the Mormons as secular, like, or that is to say, the understressing, the downplaying, the marginalization of the carnal theology was just the thing that one did if one was redescribing the Mormons as family friendly, as making family theology after all, as committed most of all to bioreproduction, as committed most of all to colonization, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes sense. But I was struck at how much else there was in the archive of 19th century Mormonism. The post-manifesto rescripting of Mormon sacred history as culminating in a moment of comedy between the Mormons and the state when they renounced polygamy, that has a lot to do with it. That has a lot to do with like sanctifying a version of Mormon history wherein, oh, the state that was trying to kill the Mormons for them a long time, that the Mormons were happy to murder people in. Actually, there was just a misunderstanding. We were the same all along, and then we came together. Like, and if you're really inside that, and there's reasons to be really inside that, it makes these other stories just apparitional, hard to see, or makes them seem weird, or like, which is totally fair. Like, oh, that person is over insisting on sex. All right. Okay, but I'm trying not to over insist on sex as such. I'm trying to insist on a carnality that was mobilized in all these contradictory plastic ways in the churn of 19th century empire.
Tim actually covered a significant portion of my question. I just wanted to thank you so much for charging in and offering this counter history of early Mormonism, like centering specifically, like just calling on the carpet the elephant in the room, the fact that divine carnality really was and is the beating heart of so much of what Joseph Smith thought was. And I just wanted to say, like, as like a queer student at BYU, and interacting and trying to figure out like all of the complexities and the way that, like, the aporia of Joseph Smith kind of centers and like, I guess to kind of sort of like parody like Flannery O'Connor's, the South, her description of the South is not Christ-centered, but Christ-haunted. Like Mormonism is not Joseph Smith-centered, but it's Joseph Smith-haunted. And so I guess there's been some sort of, oh my goodness, it's so much news lately about, the ways that these paradoxes are kind of playing out in the lives of like contemporary queer Mormons. And my curiosity is, what do you see as like potentially could be a counter history of the way that, especially like the Mormon studies kind of like, church sponsored establishment tells our story? What do you think, like, do you think it would be possible to tell a 20th century counter history of Mormonism?
I know unbelievably little about the 20th century of Mormonism, like truly unbelievably little about 20th century Mormonism. My knowledge stops really in 1896 when they renounced polygamy. But I would say, along with the colleagues here, that any retelling of the history of Mormonism for its use for a more progressive future will need to go through the rigor that is exemplified by, for instance, my colleague Jasbir Puar. That is to say, it will not undersell its attachment to empire, its foundational attachment to empire and to whiteness. Again, I think Luciano is a great critic in this respect too. And that any grabbing hold of its generative counter possibilities will need to do so without expunging its bloody entailments. You know what I mean? That is, I guess, what I would say. And again, I would say, truly, thank you so much for the generosity with which you sort of read and encountered the book and made it live in a place. I appreciate that more than I can tell you.
This is like too much to even try to talk about right now, but I wanted to just make one comment and then ask something about kind of theoretical horizons as well. But the one comment is just the surfacing of Islam through your citational praxis and also through your referential, your kind of referential examples, and then even just a moment ago, the kind of secular rescue formation around women, which automatically kind of takes me to recent events in Afghanistan, amongst other kinds of kind of secular rescue feminist narratives. But I just wanted to mention that because I think there's something structural going on, and I don't know enough at all to say something about Mormonism in relation to Islam at all, but I think you might, because surfacing in the book over and over again, your examples about kind of Islam dropping out of any kind of redemptive space of secularism. And again, and also just the historical events and other kinds of figurations of Islam that are in the book. So I thought that was just really interesting and maybe something to take a look at, because something's going on for you around that relationship, I think.
That seems to be 100% right. Like the thing I managed to say in the introduction to the book, that like the non-historical part is like, post-secular critique cannot form without the 20th century history of Islam and empire. Like it forms in the teeth of it. Like all of the conceptual grounding points of the book come explicitly from that. And it's just sort of like, I totally like take your point that is like a horizon of thought that the book just doesn't arrive at when talking about the Mormons and talking about the Mormon 19th century.
Well, it definitely, the text performs a relationship that I don't know kind of what it is. So I'm really curious about it. But the last thing, I just wanted to reroute us to queer theory and queer of color critique, because that's actually where you start in the book. And, I'm thinking about this queer secularism and the problems of it, right? Like, and even in this conversation, we're talking about secularism as kind of removed a little bit, not always, of course, but the relationship between sect and between sex and secularism, or Maya's work now on sectarianism and sex, and the role of secularism of maintaining a kind of binary gender, sexual difference, right? A binary sexual difference is really important as well. So I'm just curious about what the horizon of queer of color critique is for you. And, this kind of naughtiness around who's working on kind of religion and sex, and then who's working on queer theory keeps reproducing itself in various ways. And I think that your text is really giving us a lot of fodder for disrupting that reproduction.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jasbir. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Dana.
Friends, thank you so much for this, and for taking the time, for all the labor, for just like the prolific generosity of your thinking. I just can't appreciate it enough.